Hello, everyone. Hello, the world. Jason Isaacs, politicos everywhere. Let's do democracy, American style. Thank you, Abingdon's finest. For those of you who don't know, you should. That's Electioneering from OK Computer, um, one of Radiohead's greatest albums, and yeah, Abingdon's finest. Okay, so come back to that. Elections in America, the country is planted thick with elections. You can't move for elections. You certainly can't go more than 2 years without a national election, and you can see them there. And you can also see how we have that model of fractal government at work. We have executives at a national and at the state level. We have legislatures at a state and a national level. We have judiciary at a state and a national level, although at a national level, of course, the judiciary is not elected. But generally speaking, you can't move in America for elections. And this has all sorts of enormous consequences. I mean, first of all, it's incredibly costly. And it also means that everyone is constantly stuck in the short term. But it should mean, at the very least, that the country is incredibly democratic. But of course, this is America and it's never that simple. And in order to understand the peculiar aspects of democracy in the United States, we need to go backwards. Now, you'll know from the earlier presentations that one of the things the founding fathers were allegedly terrified by was the concept of autocracy, that is, tyrannical rule by one big guy who was immensely powerful and he crushed everybody under his brutal wheel. Well, that was true, certainly in terms of the founding fathers' mythology, the founding mythology of the United States. But there's another sense in which the founding fathers were terrified of tyranny, and that was the tyranny of the majority, tyranny of the masses. The masses, as far as they were concerned, were asses. And the very last thing that the founding fathers wanted to do was to give the people power, because they might go and do something really stupid with it, like, I don't know, vote for a tangerine property developer, half man, half tangerine, or indeed do something truly insane and self-destructive like Brexit. So what they would seek to do was to, yes, have some democracy, but it was going to be a managed form of democracy, or more typically what we would call an elite theory of democracy. And we can see that all the way through the original structures of the United States Constitution. So we'll start with the Electoral College. You'll know now that the Electoral College is, I think the technical phrase is, a great steaming mess. But originally it was a form of representative democracy. The states would decide who they wanted to go along and exercise their judgment and choose a president. So the states would send delegates to the Electoral College. The Electoral College would get in there, lock the door, they'd all drink a lot of beer, and sooner or later they'd decide on who was going to be the president. The best, the brightest, the bravest, the biggest amongst them would emerge as the president. That was how the Electoral College was supposed to work. Now that started to change in the early 19th century. The practice changed. The Constitution itself did not. So the Constitution is unamended. We still have that Electoral College, but of course now the delegates are, in the larger part, or the vastly larger part, pledged delegates. So if your state returns a victory for this president or that president, then your state's delegates are bound to vote for that president, for that candidate. Sorry, there are of course a few that use proportional representation, and I think there's one. We had one instance, maybe I think last time around, of faithless delegates, as they were called. But the key thing there to grasp is that the Electoral College is an atavism. It's an atavism of this elite theory of democracy, that we don't want the people making decisions because they might make bad decisions. And, well, fortunately, that's never happened. So, it's a theoretical problem more than the real problem. Wrong! Anyway, so the practice started to change in the 19th century, early 19th century. The constitutional structures remain the same. You can look at it there. Like a snake's hip bones, they are atavisms of a pre-democratic past. The other thing that was originally not quite as democratic as you might think was the selection of your senators. Just like just like the president, the senators would be appointed by your state legislatures, and they would go along. And once in the Senate, the idea, certainly in its formative incarnation, was that they wouldn't really concern themselves with state matters. They would be there to make national decisions, or they would be there as the state's voice when it came to making national decisions. And that's why every state has two. They're not really representatives of the state people or the state's interest as much as they were supposed to be representatives of the state at a management level, at a national management level. So the fact that each state sent two suggested that what they were supposed to be doing was not really speaking for the interests of their state at a national level, but rather just being part of the decision-making process. Somebody from Minnesota who was part of the decisions that would shape the wider policy of the United States, rather than going along to Washington and advocating for the interests of Minnesota or Florida or whatever it was. So they were not supposed to be parochial in terms of focus, but rather national in terms of focus. But of course, as soon as you introduce elections, that changes, because now they're accountable to the voters, and the voters aren't going to be interested in their national policy as much as they are bringing home the bacon for their particular state. Now, that was the 17th Amendment that passed in 1913. So there we have a structural change to the Constitution, and the consequences of that are vast. Still, the Senate retains its role as a national policymaker, or as someone who tries to shape the national agenda. And it's the Senate that ratifies presidential appointments, and it's the Senate that ratifies treaties. But at the same time, the Senate is now much more obsessed with parochial concerns than the Founding Fathers ever hoped it would be. Now, whether you think that's a good or a bad thing is effectively moot. What we're trying to get across here is that when the Founding Fathers designed the Constitution, they had at the forefront of their minds fear of autocracy, yes, but at the same time they had fear of the tyranny of the majority, the idea that a persistent majority might hijack the democratic process and impose its will on a persistent minority through democratic process. So, for example, left-handed people live shorter than right-handed people on average, because they are subject to the tyranny of the majority. Doors are designed for right-handed people. Writing is designed for right-handed people. Corkscrews, for God's sake, are designed for right-handed people. So you can understand, when a left-handed person wants to do the decent thing and open a bottle of wine, and they have to struggle because everything wants to turn the wrong way, you can understand why they'd die earlier. They'd probably want to die earlier if you had to go through that sort of ordeal to open a bottle of wine. Anyway, I'm digressing. The point is, the Founding Fathers, yes, they were concerned about autocrats, but they were also concerned about peasants. There was Shays' Rebellion. There's all sorts of instances in the founding, in the original, in the formative years of the Confederation, of the Articles of the Confederation of the Articles government, that suggested to them that yes, they needed to worry about autocracy, yes, but they must keep their lid on the peasants because the masses are asses. So yeah, democracy, but a managed or an elite form of democracy, certainly in its original incarnation, because they were scared of populism. They didn't want the people necessarily getting what they wanted, because the interests of the people might not necessarily be the same as the interests of the elite that ran American society. And we can certainly see that all the way through the Civil War and slavery and racism, all of that. Populism is being either kept in check or manipulated to preserve the interests of the ruling elite. Now, you might say that's a very cynical interpretation of American history, but I've been called an awful lot worse than the cynic, and I would stand by that particular position. In any event, the Constitution was designed to prevent populism raising its ugly head, or at least not in a way that was going to upset the interests of the ruling elite. Now, obviously, they've been completely torpedoed by Trump, which is a monumental manifestation of populism. And so, once again, man makes plans and the gods laugh. So we have the idea that democracy is there. Democracy will protect against autocracy, But at the same time, what we want to try to do is to prevent against populism. This the elite theory of democracy is there to guard against populism, and the managed or fragmented nature of democracy in the United States is there to guard against the tyranny of the majority. So against the tyranny of the majority, we've got a Bill of Rights. If you have rights, then it doesn't matter what the majority wants, they can't be taken away. And the other way in which we guard against the tyranny of the majority, remember, that is the domination of a persistent minority by a persistent majority through the democratic process, is by breaking up the electoral system. If we break up the electoral system, if we have different constituencies, if we have different methods, if we have all of these different things, then we should essentially guard against the tyranny of the majority. So the masses are asses. We're worried about populism. We're worried about the tyranny of the majority. We address populism by elite theory of democracy. We address the tyranny of the majority by electoral diversity. And we are more or less there in terms of democracy resources. There's so many. Keith Hughes is awesome on this. You've got to get on Keith Hughes. He's very, very good. And the Crash Course in American Politics, also very, very good. And that's it. Again, democracy, yes, but too much democracy opens the door to populism and the tyranny of the majority. So we guard against populism by the elite theory of democracy, and we guard against the tyranny of the majority by electoral diversity. And we guard against mundanity with Radiohead. Is that really a word? Did I mean to say mediocrity? I don't know. Ask me in class.